Hello, everybody. Some of you may know my name is Stephen Banks, and I am the professor of saxophone at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York, which you can see behind me. I had to get on the bandwagon and do a virtual background so you can see how beautiful it is here. And today I'm really excited to talk about note grouping um, for saxophonists specifically. So um, I'm going to cover the book Sound in Motion by David Mcgill. And that book originally has a lot of great examples in it, but sometimes when I was first reading it, I remember thinking that it was sort of hard to think about how it would relate to me specifically as a saxophonist. So I've got plenty of examples from our repertoire and things that we can go through. So um, note grouping has really changed my life as a saxophonist and as a
Bonus and
musician.
as a musician.
And the thing that I find, or one of the things that I find to be so great about it, is that it's made me a lot more confident in my interpretive skills. Um, and that is partially because it's helped me channel the passion that I have for music into something that I can explain to other people and share really easily with audiences and also with students. Um, but it also just the act of going through and figuring it out it forces you to study the score more. It forces you to play with intention because you have to think about what your intent is. Um, and it's also, as a sidebar, helped me a lot with memorization because there is never a time where I'm playing where I don't feel exactly where I'm going. And so if I know where I'm going and how I have to get there, then it's much easier to sort of repeat that um, even when the music's not there. Um, Additionally, it has helped quite a bit with technique. And be, the way that that works is basically when you group notes in different ways, which I'm sure many of us have done, many of us have tried um, different note grouping exercises to work on technique. Um, but even when you perform um, grouping sets of 16th notes or whatever fast notes you're playing in different ways can oftentimes take away that difficult interval or take away that difficult um, passage between notes because those notes don't actually belong together. So you can finish your first note and then move on to the next thing, which actually takes away the problem of that transition. Um, so that's how it's helped with technique. Um, and also with air support, because if you're trying to lead through certain notes, then we're not even going to hear that if you don't do it with your air support. And so if you have a lot of intent behind what you're doing, then there's much less of a chance that you're going to be under supporting when you know where your goals are, what you're trying to do. Um, and um, Additionally, it's helped with being able to control tone color and sound in general. Again, because once I commit to the shape or the grouping that I really like to use as a player, I then have to make sure that my instrument can do that. So, say we're trying to arrive on something on a middle D, and I know that I really need to play that middle D in tune, and the only way I can play middle D in tune is by adding the low B key. Um, that can be a problem because if you get to that note and you have to have middle D with the low B key, then the tone color of that D is going to be quite different. And maybe that's not the color you want on your arrival. So you have to be able to play that D with the intonation that you need and with the tone color that you need, mainly because you know that the music is telling you that that's where it should go. And you don't want to allow your instrument to hold you back from that. And then the last thing that I'll mention now that I think note grouping has helped me with is being able to communicate effectively with my quartet in Canary. Um, I remember the first time I read this book was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and immediately after that, I went to the guys and said, I think we all need to at least read a little bit of this so that we can start communicating using these systems. And because I think we had a lot of trouble communicating with each other in terms of what exactly we're trying to say. And rather than us trying to um, all figure out four different ways of saying the exact same thing, we could sort of take it down to the numbers and take it down to exactly what we want to do and agree on that. Excuse me. And so that really, really streamlined our rehearsal process. So with no further ado, I'm very, very excited to go ahead and jump in here. So, since there are a lot of videos and this presentation is pretty interactive, I'm going to turn off my video now so that I can save some bandwidth and hopefully the presentation will continue to look good for you all. So I'm going to turn this off now. Great. Okay, so the book that all of this is coming from is Sound in Motion by David Mcgill. And it has, like I said before, completely changed my life for the reasons I mentioned before. But it also includes a lot of philosophical discussion about music and performing in general, information about rehearsal and performance etiquette in the orchestral world, which is very helpful. And I remember my first orchestra rehearsals very much thinking about the things that I learned in this book and being very thankful that I had read it. And suggestions for great artists and recordings to listen to, etc. So it just has a lot of really wonderful, useful information, and I would just really highly recommend it. And highly recommend reading the entire thing and trying to interact with the book. So when you see an example, actually getting your horn out and trying to do it, trying to be able to make the sounds and the lines that he's talking about so that you can feel it in action. So David Mcgill, the author of Sound in Motion, is the professor of bassoon at Northwestern University, and he has obviously, as you can see, had a lot of success in the orchestral world, being the principal bassoonist of the Chicago Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, Toronto Symphony, Tulsa Philharmonic, and I think a couple of others at certain points, but these were the main ones. And I did actually get to study with David Mcgill on one occasion, and it's sort of a funny story because when I first decided to go to Northwestern, I was obviously beyond the moon to study with Tamor Sullivan, but I was also really excited to be able to learn from David Mcgill. And so I reached out to him immediately, and he invited me to come over to his house to discuss the book. And naturally, when I got there, at the time we had discussed and everything, he opened the door and he's in his bathrobe. And I was confused a little bit. I was like, oh, should I come back later or something? And I think he had just totally forgotten that I was coming over. But then he invited me in, and I think he was getting ready to take a shower, so he made me some tea, took a shower, and then came back down, and we got to talk for several hours about the book. And just as sort of a disclaimer for the entire presentation, while this note grouping method comes from Marcel Tabuteau, I personally, did not study with Marcel Tabuteau, and neither did David Mcgill, but it's something that has been passed down through his teachers, and that I think he, through research, has been able to codify well. Speaking of Marcel Tabuteau, He was the principal oboist of the Philadelphia Orchestra. He taught at Curtis for many years, and he's also attributed to being the founding father of the American School of Oboe Playing, but also the American School of Woodwind Playing in general, of wind playing. And much of that comes from this note grouping idea, because not only did he teach oboists at the Curtis Institute, he also led the woodwind class. And in that, he got to interact with musicians of all wind instruments. And many of those musicians that studied with him attribute much of their success to their studies with Marcel Tabuteau. And to put into perspective the power of his teaching, I was really, really shocked to see that he only had about 50 students over the course of, his entire tenure at Curtis. That's 50 oboe students. And almost half of them, so almost 25 of them, landed principal oboe positions in major orchestras, principal oboe or English horn positions in major orchestras. So for all the teachers out there, I think we can definitely understand that that is a incredible ratio. Great. So we're going to go ahead and get into his ideas on note grouping. So note grouping is a method of organizing notes according to their perceived musical function in order to clearly convey the ideas and emotional intent of the composer. And the next bullet point here I just took from the book to define why note grouping is important. After learning how to read music, musicians must be re-educated in a higher state of understanding. Just as there are grammatical rules that structure our sentences in the most communicative way, there are also musical rules that allow musical tones to speak more clearly. And this is something that I think we will be talking about throughout the presentation, in that when we see music on the page, it doesn't necessarily always translate to how it should exist in the air and in the hall when we play. And this, I think, is best codified by thinking about spoken word versus written word. In the English language, we have both a word for speaking and for writing. But in music, we sort of just have the word music. And so whether it's sheet music or music that we're listening to, it's all music. And so sometimes I think that we confuse music that exists out in the world with sheet music. And the analogy that David Mcgill uses for these two things is to think about having a conversation with a good friend of yours on the telephone. And when you do that, you would never think that the medium or the method in which you are communicating with your friend or colleague is the conversation itself. So in terms of music, the sheet music is sort of like the telephone. It just allows the conversation to happen. But it is not the conversation at all. It's not the grammatical structure of how you say things. And so we're going to be using note grouping to allow the conversation to be facilitated more easily. All right, so getting into the basics of note grouping. So when we learn music for the first time, we think about eighth notes and 16th notes, quarter notes. We're always basing them around the downbeat being what we should accent, essentially. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, if we're thinking eighth notes, as you see on the top line. And then after that, we after we think about the downbeat, the offbeat is often de-emphasized. So again, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, and so that ends up making everything feel a little bit vertical, and end up sounding a little bit more like this, um, in terms of volume. So these numbers are dealing with volume. 2 1 2 1 4 3 2 1 4 3 2 1, which is not really leading forward at all. And so the premise of note grouping, um, of Tabuteau's version of note grouping, is moving that over by 1/16th note or 1/8th note, depending on the situation. So in this case, you can see that we'll have 1 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, and so every time you get to a downbeat, you're immediately moving actively towards the next beat, and that, is the basis of what creates that forward motion. So I'll play a quick clip here of David Mcgill, demonstrating a little bit of that. So what I'd like for you to listen for in this clip is the way that he uses the second note of each beat to take us to that next downbeat. So you'll hear this in both eighth notes and 16th notes in this example. This is the third movement of Saint-Saëns' bassoon sonata. So I think that that, is a really wonderful example of showing how the forward motion and also the sense of rubato when pulling back comes from that second note there. Um, Great. So now we're going to get a little bit more into things that you as saxophonists might be able to use in your own playing. And I have to give a quick disclaimer, with the videos that you'll hear. So just for the sake of this presentation, I recorded some videos, but just take them with a grain of salt. The before videos are oftentimes very, very dry and not necessarily anything that you would actually do when you perform, but it's just so that you hear the differences between the different types of grouping. So with each type of grouping, we're going to go through a lyrical example and a technical example. So for basic grouping, we'll listen to Robert Schumann's Three Romances, the first of the three. And in the first video you'll hear, you're going to hear what I was speaking about in terms of sort of accenting each beat and using the downbeat to create the motion, which oftentimes ends up feeling really vertical. So dee-dum, 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 in the middle of a long line. Okay, and then I'll go over to Tabuteau's method of grouping, which you'll see on the bottom line here. And this is also going to be exaggerated just so you get the picture. Okay, so neither one of those methods is what you're going to want to use in an actual performance. Um, but they can show just the difference. So when I hear using the upbeat to move forward, it already makes me feel like I'm going somewhere, even if it is a little bit seasick feeling. So I wanted to play a third recording where I'm trying to synthesize Tabuteau's method of grouping with a broader understanding of the piece. So that is coming from knowing that on the downbeat of the second measure here, the second measure, the piano plays, and then you react to that on beat two, and then you're leading down until the downbeat of the third measure, or excuse me, one, two, three, downbeat of the fourth measure on the G, where the piano then drops down and plays in the low register. And so we're sort of synthesizing this into a sensical, fully formed interpretation here. All right. So hopefully that shows a little bit of the basic idea of how it can apply to that excerpt. Um, so here in technical passages, this one is from the Closet Etude Book 25 Studies. Um, so similar idea. So in the first video, you'll hear just really trying to play it metronomically, straight down with what the metronome would be doing, and it feels a little bit stiff. Okay, so in the next video, I'm going to try to move that over just a little bit so I'm not necessarily accenting the first note, but then immediately leading to my next beat and then to the next beat and to the next beat. And this one is a little bit less audible of a difference, but I can tell you that in my fingers, when I'm playing this, it feels completely different. It feels like the entire time I'm just floating on water, like a boat floating on water, and that I'm never getting bogged down in one spot. That I'm continually moving forward. So a little bit less of a difference there, just because the notes are moving by so quickly. But at the end of the day, this is also an etude, so it's not necessarily something you would perform, but it's one way of just feeling a little bit more grounded in what you're playing. And I also find that with students, when they think like this, they're more likely to be aware of the metronome because they're trying to lead to the metronome, and they want that metronome to be a point of arrival rather than just sort of a tick mark to show whether you're playing in time or not. So taking this just a little bit further, we get into what he refers to as rhythmic grouping. So whereas before we were just using duples and 16th notes, now we're going to be using different types of rhythms, septuplets, sextuplets, quintuplets, and beyond. And so it's the same general concept, using that second note which defines the rhythm to help lead you forward and backwards, depending on the passage. I also want to say that it's, of course, very important to learn the exact subdivisions when you play these rhythms. So this isn't a free pass to just sort of hold on to downbeats whenever you want and then rush the rest of a beat. But it is something that when once you have the rhythms really really solid, that you can add to make sure that your interpretation has a sense of forward motion. So for this, we'll be using Bosa's improv from Improv at Caprice and a little bit of the Glazing Concerto. So I'll spare you the wrong version to look at here, but you can see starting in the second measure of the top line that instead of starting feeling the triplet on that downbeat, we're starting on the second note, leading to the next downbeat, and then immediately taking ourselves up to the top note. So the first video I'll play is of not using the Tabuteau method and just sort of trying to stay metronomic. Okay, and now we're moving that emphasis over just a little bit and trying to connect from beat to beat. Okay, so I think that that one is a pretty good example because it actually has so many different types of rhythms in a short period of time. And so probably my favorite part of the second recording is down at the end of that where you see this triplet that has the slight writ going into the E sharp, because I feel that thinking of getting into that E sharp in this way allows me to naturally do the retard starting on that last beat, dim, ba, da, dim, rather than just sort of trying to play it really square. Okay, and then technical example from Glazing Concerto. This one I find really interesting because, of course, there's not necessarily a right and wrong way to phrase, but it's still possible to play this line starting from the E natural here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but starting from this E natural here, it's easy to play this and still crescendo, and it will feel really good. But I think there's more that we can do with it. So here is just sort of articulating where I need to and doing the articulations as I need to and trying to get a little faster, but around the downbeat. Okay, and then the next video, I'm going to use the second 16th note of each slur marking to start my crescendo into the next beginning of a slur marking. So from the D sharp in the incalzando measure, from this D sharp, I'll be taking this all the way to the G. And then from the F sharp, I'm going all the way to the B. And so what I find with this is that since it's chromatic, that sense of crescendo the entire time really makes this feel like a whirlwind, because you're blowing air through the chromatic line as it happens, and it, to me, makes it feel just a lot more exciting. Cool, so I hope you can hear that. All right, moving on to the next type of grouping, motivic grouping. Um, so a motif is a short rhythmic or melodic musical idea that occurs throughout a composition. It can be manipulated in many ways: inverted, divided, expanded, contracted, and so forth. Although a motif is clearly identifiable most of the time, tradition can dictate distorted ways of playing that can obscure a motif's true shape. So, the first thing that came to mind actually when I was thinking of a lyrical example for this was the Maurice Tableau de Provence, the fourth movement. Um, and it's a beautiful work, sort of however you phrase it in a way. Um, but I think that there's a lot more clarity that can be brought to it using this idea of motivic grouping. So to start off, you have to identify your motive, and I think it's really sort of hammered over our head right there at the beginning, and it keeps coming back throughout the movement. This idea of dee dum, and so the first step after you identify your motive is then to figure out, how do I want to play the motive? Am I going to lean on the first note and then come back? Am I going to play them equally? Am I going to lead from the first note to the second note? And in this case, um, as the title suggests, um, I feel that it should be a sigh, or like a feeling of respiration, that sort of feeling. Yadam, yadam. And so that's how I'm going to try to perform all the different parts, or all of the different iterations of that motive. So here, I've just selected a few um, spots in the part that I think are related to that motif, that are not directly just a descending step like this. So there are some that are larger intervals, but I think that when you find them, they're easy to identify based on how the phrase markings are done and everything. So here are just a few of those examples. So all of those, I just sort of picked randomly from different parts in the movement. And so with each one of those, I'm still trying to put stress on the first note that then gradually comes back to the second note. So that feeling of a sigh. And then so to put this into practice, chose this section towards the end of the movement. And this one, I decided to try to give a before video that I'm still really phrasing a lot. And this is something that has been especially helpful for me, because I think when I was, especially in undergrad, I would try to phrase things in a certain way, but it was more so based on just trying to feel it. And so if I felt like in that exact moment that I wanted to, do a crescendo, or I wanted to just hold this note for a long time for whatever reason, then I would just do it. And then I'd sort of hear feedback, like, it seems like you're a little over the top with your rubato and what you're doing, and I just, got really upset by that and thought that, they just don't understand that I'm trying to be free and all of that. But then I found that if I identify motifs, then those types of things are easier. It's easier to feel it in the moment because I know the structure of what I should be feeling. So here's a before that's just sort of musical, but a little random. So then in the next clip, I'm going to try to make all of the sections that are rounded off or that are squared here sound like the motif. So, even though it might be with different intervals or even having articulations in between. So hopefully that comes across. And then I sort of took away the climax for all of these because my high E, the vibrato was a little janky. So sorry for not giving you the climax there. Okay, great. So in a technical example, back to the Glazunov, I thought this one was really interesting because I think that the motif is found in the piano part, in the score, or in the orchestra. Um, and many times when we play the Glazunov concerto, we're sort of just trying to get it down. We're preparing it for an audition or whatever it is, and we just see crescendo. So we just do a crescendo, and that's fine. But there's something deeper there. So here's just playing it down, doing a crescendo and decrescendo. Okay. Um, but if we look a little deeper into the actual score, we see that what the whole ensemble is doing is more so based on the quarter note or on these little eighth note gestures that happen on each beat. And so then I would try to break down my line or my group line of 16th notes to where I can most easily communicate with the ensemble or with my pianist. So then I'm trying to use my downbeats to help identify and codify the motive in the way that I'm playing it. And so I would practice doing that like this. And so some of us, we might call that just finding the skeleton of the passage. But I think it's a little bit more than just finding the skeleton because it's also making sure that the skeleton sounds exactly how it needs to, and exactly the way that you would need to phrase it if you were playing the accompanimental part itself. Um, and so after doing that and making sure that that feels really, really good, then I'll add the other notes back in. And I'm still now doing a crescendo, but that crescendo is then informed by what's happening in the other voices. So for me, that recording that specific spot was actually a little bit more difficult than I thought it would be because to really make each beat feel like it is aligned with the motif itself um, was more than just trying to accent each beat and grow a little bit. It's really trying to feel um, that sort of the weight that needs to happen on each beat and how it needs to just grow just a little bit and then a little bit more and then needs to come back, and then when you start the next measure, when you start the next iteration of the motif in the second measure, it has to go back to feeling exactly how you did at the very beginning. So crescendoing and decrescendoing the exact right amount is fairly difficult. Okay, and then on to the final um, section or way of grouping. And it's mainly about using the grouping that we've already figured out and learning how to scale that. Um, when I was studying with Dr. Murphy, um, he used to tell me, Stephen, you cannot play infinitely loud. So if you play a line that is, 3 bars long, you can't just keep crescendoing the entire time. You can't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 20 or something like that. So these are two ways here that we can use our note grouping to create forward motion while also making sure that we are able to maintain a good sound and not crescendoing or decrescendoing too quickly or too abruptly. So in this example here, it's just sort of showing that you lead to each beat, and those beats gradually go up by one at a time, and then you drop back down um, so that you can lead forward accordingly. And then here is another technique that you can use for that. That is leading to the downbeat, and then right before you get to that downbeat, just coming back a little bit so that it feels a little bit more settled, and that it's not accentuated or anything like that. So these are two ways of doing it on a small scale. But since we've sort of talked through a couple of small scale note grouping examples at this point, I wanted to get a little bit more nitty gritty with this one and discuss a passage into Crook based on this range and scaling idea, but also looking at the score and figuring out how it works on maybe a larger scale. Um, so I think that we all know this part of De Crook. It's after um, many of us know as the double tonguing section. Um, and what I find is that most of the time when we come out of that, people are just burning all the way from measure 51 here to the end of this little section, which takes you into circle 42. Um, and the problem with that is that there are actual dynamics that should grow and decay within all of that. So we get to forte here, but the actual arrival is over here at fortissimo. And so if we are blowing our brains out over here, then there's no way that we can actually create a sense of forward motion getting into the climax. So that would sound a little bit like this. And so for me, I think that there are a lot of people that would, take that to their lesson or perform that and feels pretty good about playing it like that. Um, but I think we can maybe look a little deeper and try to figure out how this is organized and how we can make that climax feel more organic. So in taking all of the things that we've done today, the first thing that I see is a short motive. I see a motif. This idea of dee yadam yadam, and then that happens again in measure 53 or circle 41, if you can see that. Da yadim ya, and then it goes further this time. Um, but that motive itself is delineated by a double bar here, so that always tells us that the composer is trying to um, show the end of a section, or at least the beginning of something a little bit new. And so what I would suggest is to define how you want to play that. And so here I have numbers in terms of 6 back to 5. Sort of it has this rocking feel to it. Ba-ya-dum. And then the 2/4 bar here with the quarter note triplets at this point is just a transition. It's just a way to get you back to that motive again. So dum yadim yadum ba dee dum yadim, and then we start it again, and then it becomes so exciting when we then go somewhere else. So now we're ascending and going up to our B flat, which I put at an 8, because at this point we're still growing. We see that the bass comes in, the left hand of the piano joins, but there's maybe a little bit of a harmonic shift in the piano, and then we sort of come back down again in measure 55. But then we climb even higher, so now we're up to a C here at the bottom of the page. I'm speaking in saxophone pitch, not reading what's here, just so you know. Then we climb up to a C, and that'll be a 9 now. And then we might come back a little bit, but then now we're actually at fortissimo. So now I'm going to say we can take it all the way up to a real 10, which is generally the highest part of the numbering system, 10. So now we're over here really playing passionately, and then we can diminuendo beyond that. And I think that this diminuendo is marked before the 2/4 bar there, because there's a sense of tension that happens with this C sharp dominant that we have here. So I'm going to play a little clip of that first, and then I'm going to talk more about the harmonic idea I just introduced. Great. So grouping it in that way makes me feel that from the very beginning of this section all the way to the climax, I'm continuing to grow throughout the entire thing. So one thing that we're not really going to get into talking about today too much is harmonic grouping, but the basic tenet of that is that harmonies that have a lot of tension in them, so dominant harmonies, you want to lean into, and then you back off a little bit into cadences or releases of that tension. And so here we see that the diminuendo starts on a little bit after beat 3 of measure 57, and I think that that's because the height of the harmonic tension is on beat 3, and so after that we then relax into what is actually a deceptive cadence of sorts, because we see that there's a 5 chord or a dominant function chord that does not resolve down by 5th, but it takes us to actually sort of the flat 3rd in a major context. So just so you can hear that, include a little clip here of that deceptive motion. And so if you can't necessarily hear the bass motion in that clip, that's okay, but I would recommend just going and finding your favorite recording of the Crook and listening for that and seeing if you can feel how wonderful that feels when it just sort of takes you by surprise harmonically. Okay, so to our last example here, this is a culmination of all of the ideas that we've looked at. So you see rhythmic grouping, um, that's happening in terms of the parentheses. And then there's range and scaling, um, in terms of when I'm going from the first measure into the second measure, it's not just 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3. And so from the downbeat of the first measure to the downbeat of the second measure, I've grown and I have connected the 16th notes within each beat, but it's not just one consistent crescendo taking me to 10 or 11 or whatever the number would be. And then we also have motivic grouping that you see in the red boxes. I've identified this first motive as 2 bars, and then the second motive as 1 bar that descends and then ascends again. Um, and and then there's of course also basic grouping in just the idea that we're never using the downbeat as the beginning of something. We're using that second note to be the beginning of the forward motion. So in this first clip, you'll hear the crescendo happen, and so I'll start around mezzo piano and then crescendo and try to do all the dynamics that are written, and then we'll hear it with a little bit more attention to detail. Okay, and then this second clip is with me trying to do all of the concepts that I have here. So just a little bit more obvious intention behind that. Okay, so some conclusions from all of these things. I think the biggest one is just to have a plan. Whether you use this numbering system or not, I think it's important to know that you should have a plan for your phrasing. And I know that we all know that, but I think more of us than we'd like to admit go into performances without really having a plan. And a lot of times, I'll ask students, so what are you doing with this phrase? And there's sort of a shrug, and I'm not sure. And if you are playing something, then you should be trying to make sense of it. You should be trying to figure out what is the composer saying and how can I best say that, whether you're using note grouping or not. And then I also think that it's just really important, especially as saxophonists, that we never confuse technical facility with musical fluency. And that is something that is really hard to do, I think, especially like in a competition, circumstance. Um, a lot of times the person that plays with the best technique might win the competition. But I think that it's really important that we decide to value whether all of that technique was performed with intention and with a lot of care and thought, as well when we're thinking in terms of ranking or just how different performances stack up against other performances. So thinking of musical fluency over technical facility. So that's the end of what I have prepared here. And so I think at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions that people might have. We can throw them in the chat box. Okay. Oh, just a couple of private messages here. Um, just wait a couple of seconds to see if any come through. Okay, so Andrew Kovaleski asks, so the numbers correspond generally to a quantification of intensity? Um, yes. So the numbers, depending on the type of grouping you're doing, um, mean different things. So if in the basic grouping context, they are just sort of a way of grouping the notes, not necessarily based on intensity. But when we get to thinking about range and scaling, then we're getting really, really nitty gritty in terms of like a six needs to be a little bit more intense and have a slightly more forward tone color than a five. Um, and a seven needs to have more of this than a six. So it's intensity, tone color, dynamic, articulation, um, just general um, everything that can go into creating more passion. So yeah, basically intensity. Um, Ethan Wetzel says, how have these ideas evolved through your study with Dr. Murphy and Professor Sullivan? Uh, the all of these ideas actually I didn't really talk about much with my teachers in school. This is something that I used for myself because I wanted to understand why I was doing all of the things that I was doing. And also, I really wanted to understand why people were saying that it seemed like I was phrasing quote unquote too much or um, not being thoughtful with what I was doing and just sort of feeling it. And those comments didn't really come from my teachers, but I did I did want to use note grouping to help me find my own voice a little bit more clearly. Um, okay, Michael Atkinson. Hey, Michael. Um, says, when approaching more new music like Noda, Loba, do you use the more motivic style of grouping to approach more gestural ideas? Um, yes, and so that's a good question, and it also opens up the can of worms that I think most of us as saxophonists start playing music that is too too difficult for us musically before we have an understanding of how musical like grammatical structure works. Um, so when you get to playing contemporary music like Noda and Loba that is highly sophisticated, you definitely want to take inspiration from these ideas of note grouping and just understanding how the music works and how the music is structured, was structured in the composer's mind. Um, and that often comes from having a better understanding of traditional phrasing. So I absolutely use this in new music. Eric Zhang says, when would you begin these kinds of discussions with your students? Whether they be a watered down abstraction of these concepts or the full fledged presentation you just gave. Um, Honestly, I'm still really figuring that out. Um, this is something that is so incredibly important to me, but um, it can seem boring, I think. And I think that it's hard to inspire students to understand how helpful it is and all of the different ways that it is helpful. And so I talk about it with my students most often, I think, in terms of technique and trying to allow them to really feel every note and know that every note has a purpose that is either moving forward or backwards, but also to make sure that they're not rushing because they have to really feel the importance of each note. Um, so, and then of course we talk about it more in a musical context, depending on the piece and whatnot. but there's so much to go through. So I'm still working on that, on how I'm going to infuse it into everyday lesson teaching. Because for me, when I practice, it's absolutely my everyday bread and butter. Um, Joe Himmelberg says, at what stage of the preparation of a piece do you think note grouping should be implemented? Is this something that you do from day one or something that you get into once you're comfortable with the piece? Um, so, first of all, I should say that when I met with David Mcgill to, to talk through this concept, he told me that he had never done this with an entire piece. And that really freaked me out because I was like, oh, but you wrote a whole book on it. I thought this was your thing, sort of. And he told me that he often used it in um, difficult passages musically, and also that he used it a lot when he was younger to learn excerpts and things like that. And so I actually usually take it a little bit further than he does or did. And when I first started doing note grouping, I did it with, I remember the first piece I did it with was the Fuzzy Bird Sonata. And so my copy of Fuzzy Bird, there is a literal number on every single note, of the first movement at least. And just having to think through all of that was really helpful for me. Um, so the idea of note grouping, I think, has to be implemented from the very beginning of your learning process because that is you learning the actual music itself. Um, but in terms of actually sitting down and writing out 8765, 7654, maybe that can be more of an exercise so that you then start feeling what all of these ideas should feel like. Um, and so, I think you could do it at any part of the process, but for me, I usually do it at the beginning of the process, and then after that, or when I'm, even if I'm outside of the context of that piece, I'm always thinking about how would this be grouped. So if I'm sight reading something, I'm still thinking using the muscles that I've flexed, in terms of knowing that, oh, anything here needs to lead to the next beat, or where am I trying to lead now? Where am I going? And so that concept comes more naturally now to me than it did ever before. So I hope that helps. Um, Christina Lamarca, hi Christina, says, what advice might you share for high school musicians who are just starting their interpretive journey in their individual studies? What were your first steps? Um, I would encourage them to read the book, to read the book Sound in Motion first, um, because I think that um, David Mcgill really, really lays out philosophically why this is important and sort of defines the fact that what you see on the paper is not is not music in the sense of a performance. It is, a physical representation of it that helps you create the performance. Um, so with a high school student, I might just have them do basic grouping exercises with a piece that they're learning, even if it's something for band. So if there's something that has eighth notes and 16th notes and triplets, just sort of on a first level, just going through and moving that one over to that second note and knowing that they need to move forward with that. I think that musicians of other instruments do that a lot sooner than we do, not necessarily in terms of note grouping, but in terms of always leading through certain lines and identifying like what appoggiatures are and things like that. So I think it could happen in high school with just starting to think from the second note of each beat, and that would be a great place to start. I would suggest. But yes, reading the book so they can understand it in a more fully fledged out way would be great. Alex Dietz, my man, says, you mentioned at the beginning about using the number system to communicate with your quartet. How do you... Oh, can you guys still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, okay, great. Said something about my audio going out. Um, anyway, where was I? Oh, about using the number system with your quartet. How do you begin to use the number system effectively to communicate exactly what you are hearing with other people? Um, I think first, it doesn't have to be perfect. So all you would really have to say is that I want this passage to. I'm really thinking that this set of six measures should be split up into three sets of two, and the first one should be around like a two, not quite all the way down to a one, but maybe a two. The second one should be a four, and then I think that four should rest into a three in the last set of two measures. Um, so rather than saying, can we just like go up and then come down a little bit, you can just put numbers on it so that people understand how much you're talking about. Because maybe when you say, let's go up and down a little bit, they might think you're thinking 1 to 9 back to three or something. Um, Whereas you might just mean up a little bit and back. So I don't think there's any best way to start communicating with people through it. I think just trying to start often inspires the best type of conversations um, that just make you be a little bit more clear so that every time you get to that spot, you are at least in the ballpark of the intensity that you want it to be. Um, Wilson Poffenberger says, does the number sequence ever make you overthink your musical intent? um, y- I, um, no, but that's because I don't really think it's necessarily possible to overthink your musical intent. I think it's possible to overthink while you're performing, um, but I think it's really important to think very deeply for a very long period of time about what it is that you're trying to say. And that can continue to morph and change from day to day. So if you perform this today and then you perform it in 3 days, it's not going to be the same. And your intent could be the same, but when you perform it, um, you're still going to try to be human. And so all of these things just allow you to have a framework for how you know the music should sound. And then when you get to your performance, um, it should be so ingrained because you understand the grammatical structure of the music that you can sort of throw it away in the performance. So when I'm performing, I have never thought 1, 2, 3, 4. I've never thought that in an actual performance. So I don't think it makes me overthink, um, but I also don't think it's necessarily possible to overthink, especially given all of the aspects of music there are to consider: historical context, um, the composer, where they were in their life, harmonic structures, all these things. It's all fascinating. Um, Not sure how to pronounce this, but I think Ananya asks, if music is a blueprint of what to play um, for, let's see, can your interpretation stray away from the musical instructions? Oh, how far? Okay, how far can your interpretation stray away from the musical instructions given on the page? Um, I think that really depends on the composer. when we look at more contemporary composers, a lot of times they have absolutely written out every single thing that they want you to do to the nth degree, with the most complicated dynamics and complicated rhythms, nested tuplets, and things like that. Um, but if you're playing Schumann or Glazunov, Glazunov I think is a great example. Glazunov doesn't really give us a lot of instruction on how to play like the opening of of that concerto. Um, so I think for me that's a musical passage that I'm still trying to figure out exactly how it ebbs and flows in a really natural way. And so I'm using my understanding of music. I'm using my understanding of harmony and um, just contour, all these types of things, um, to help me bring out what is on the page for someone like that. And then if you go back to Bach, I mean, there's like nothing on the page except for notes. So you have to use a lot of knowledge and dedicated, um, intelligent thought to be able to bring it to life at all, knowing the dances, knowing what 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 country things are coming from, and all those different types of things. So um, your interpretation can stray away from the musical instructions on the page, but you need to have actually really thought about what those um, how you're straying and why you're straying, and if that makes sense given the music that you're playing. Um, Grace Gelpy says, have you found any applications of these phrasing ideas to your experience with improvisation and transcribing improvised solos? Um, yes. I found that being a bit of a jazz musician myself, a bit, um, has allowed me to feel more like I'm improvising when I play classical music in general. And so when you improvise something, it's important that you have intention there too. And so when you're transcribing an improvised solo, you're not only trying to get the notes, again, you're not just trying to write down the notes, you're trying to figure out and transcribe their intention, their tone color, their vibrato, their articulation, the way that they're moving their jaw to expose uh, and and muffle the reed, all those types of things. Um, so doing that in terms of jazz and transcribing, I think just makes me understand just how much detail work goes into understanding the music that is actually in the air, or the music that is actually being played. Um, if you are to codify like all of the things that are happening when someone performs, there are like there are just so many factors at play. But then you have to realize from the 10,000-mile view that um, it's all gestural, and it's all um, just trying to get across a simple idea. So I think it's allowed me to come to classical music and always know that I don't need to be so rigid, but that I do need to be really thoughtful about how I'm moving through different passages. So I hope that helps with that question. So great. Um, if there are no other questions, I'm going to stop there. Whew, this was a lot of fun for me. I hope it was interesting and maybe helpful a little bit for you all. And as always, of course, thank you so much to Dr. Nab for putting this entire thing together. I've been tuning in almost every day, and so I'm really enjoying learning from all of you out there, and from all of the great saxophone pedagogues that we have around the world. So thanks so much for tuning in.